I was sipping coffee when the envelope arrived. Thick, official, and marked with the kind of weight that makes your pulse slow before you even know why. My assistant placed it gently on my desk, saying it looked important. I smiled, pretending it was just another contract or business formality. But the moment I saw my father's name printed across the top, the air left my lungs. My hands trembled before I could steady them. It had been 13 years since I last heard from him. 13 years since the night he told me I was useless, selfish, and destined to fail like my mother. That night, I'd packed my clothes into a torn backpack, walked out into the rain, and never looked back. I thought that silence between us was permanent, an unspoken peace treaty built on distance. I was wrong. The letter inside wasn't an apology. It was a summons. My father was suing me. The claim stated that as my parent, he was entitled to half my company's assets, given his role in her upbringing and early opportunities. I reread those words again and again, my heart pounding with disbelief and something colder, recognition. This was exactly who he'd always been, a man who'd call cruelty discipline and greed love. For a moment, I just sat there, staring out the window at the city skyline I'd built my life within. Every glass tower, every late night, every scar hidden behind my success. People think money gives you freedom, but it doesn't. It just builds a cleaner cage. And now, my father had found a way to step right into it. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of years collapse into a single moment. Memories flickered like old film reels, the sound of his voice echoing through narrow hallways, the look of disappointment he wore like a badge, the day he slammed the door in my face. I had thought I buried my past. But my past wanted a piece of my future. It wasn't anger I felt first. It was shame. Shame that after everything I'd built, one letter could make me feel like that trembling girl again. The one who used to pray for approval she never got. I swallowed hard and forced myself to breathe, reminding myself who I was now. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was the woman who built an empire from nothing. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, why now? Why me? Did he see the magazine cover last month? The feature about self-made women under 40? Did he finally realize the daughter he dismissed was worth something now that her name had a price tag? The thought made me laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. My assistant poked her head through the door, asking if everything was all right. I nodded, folding the summons neatly and slipping it into my drawer. Just old business, I said. But even as I spoke, I knew this wasn't old. This was a new war. One that would drag everything I'd buried right back into the light. That night, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights blur into constellations of gold and blue. The wind was cold, but it helped me think. I had built a life rooted in discipline, silence, and control. I'd made peace with solitude. But something about this lawsuit, felt personal, almost surgical, like he was cutting into the last part of me that was still untouched by his hands. I told myself not to overthink, but I could already feel the past stirring beneath my skin. Every success, every headline, every quiet morning I'd earned, he wanted to stain it. My phone buzzed beside me, but I ignored it. The night felt too fragile for company. I finally whispered to myself, "He doesn't get to win this time," then softer, as if saying it might make it true. He doesn't even know who I am anymore. But deep down, I realized this wouldn't just be a legal fight. It would be a reckoning. And somewhere inside me, a long-suppressed voice whispered something else, something sharp and certain. Maybe it's time he finally did. I was 17 the night my father decided I wasn't his daughter anymore. It wasn't a sudden explosion, though the shouting made it sound that way. No, it was years of disappointment compressed into one long, bitter evening. He'd always said emotions were for the weak, and that I needed to act like a Harrington, as if our name alone was some kind of royal bloodline. The truth was simpler. He only cared about control, and I stopped giving him that. My brother Ethan was his masterpiece. Polished, obedient, perfect in every way my father demanded. He played golf, studied finance, and laughed at my father's cruel jokes even when they were at my expense. I used to envy him, not because he was favored, but because he didn't seem to mind being owned. That night, I came home late from working at a local cafe, a job my father had forbidden. He called it pathetic that I was serving strangers coffee when I should have been interning at his firm. But I needed that job. It wasn't about money. It was about oxygen. My one small rebellion in a house where even my thoughts felt monitored. When I walked through the door, he was already waiting in the living room, arms folded, whiskey glass glinting in the lamplight. My brother sat in the corner, silent, eyes fixed on the floor. I can still remember the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, marking the seconds before my life split in two. "So," my father began, voice calm in that terrifying way of his, "you've decided you're too good for your family now? Playing waitress instead of preparing for real success?" "I'm just working, Dad," I said quietly. "It's not forever," he laughed, a short, sharp sound that made my stomach tighten. "Not forever? You think small jobs lead to big dreams? You think anyone respects the help?" "I'm not asking for respect," I whispered. "Just space." That word, space, broke him. His calm evaporated. He stood, the veins in his neck pulsing. "You ungrateful child. I gave you everything, and you choose mediocrity. You embarrass me?" Ethan looked up then, eyes darting between us. "Dad, maybe—" "Stay out of this!" Father snapped. Then he turned back to me. "You either follow my path or you find another roof." My throat burned, but I forced myself to speak. "Then I'll find another roof." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. For a second I thought he might soften, but then he walked to the door, pulled it open, and gestured toward the darkness outside. "Go on then. Let's see how far your pride gets you." I hesitated. Not because I doubted myself, but because I still wanted him to stop me. To say something, anything, that sounded like love. But he just stood there, eyes cold, jaw clenched. So I picked up my old backpack, stuffed with clothes and sketches, and walked past him. The smell of his cologne mixed with whiskey burned in my memory as he muttered, "You'll come crawling back." I didn't look back, not even when the door slammed behind me. The sound echoed like a verdict, sharp, final, cruel. It rained that night. I remember because the water soaked through my shoes before I'd even made it to the bus stop. I sat there shivering, trying not to cry, replaying every word he said. It wasn't the first time he'd called me a disappointment, but it was the first time I realized he meant it. For weeks afterward, I stayed with a friend, sleeping on a couch that smelled like old fabric and detergent. I found a second job cleaning offices at night, saving every dollar I could. My father didn't call, neither did Ethan. The silence became its own kind of truth, one that hurt less, the more I accepted it. Sometimes, I'd imagine walking back into that house one day, successful and unbothered, just to see the look on his face, but mostly I just focused on surviving. Each paycheck felt like another step away from him. Years later, when people asked where my drive came from, I'd smile and say, disrespect, because nothing fuels you quite like being told you're worthless by someone who's supposed to love you. Even now, when I think about that night, I can still hear the click of the lock after the door closed. That small, final sound that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of father he truly was. He didn't just shut me out of the house. He shut himself out of my life, and in that silence, I began building a world where his voice no longer decided my worth. The night my father threw me out, I told myself it was temporary, that he'd cool off, that the door would open again. It never did. Weeks turned into months, and temporary became my new reality. I slept in my old Honda behind a 24-hour grocery store, using the flickering parking lot lights as my nightlamp. I learned how to fold shame into silence, how to wash up in gas station bathrooms, and how to fake normalcy when people looked too long. Every morning, I'd stare at myself in the mirror of my car's side window. Puffy eyes, cracked lips, the same hoodie for days. That reflection both broke and built me, because there, I realized that no one was coming to save me. Not my father, not my brother, not the family who pretended I'd vanished. I took every job I could find, waitressing, stacking shelves, cleaning offices after hours. I was invisible, and for a while I preferred it that way. At least invisibility meant no one could judge me. But it also meant no one saw how hard I was trying to climb out of the hole I'd been shoved into. Some nights, Exhaustion blurred the edges of everything. I'd cry quietly in the car, gripping the steering wheel as if it anchored me to existence. I promised myself I'd never beg my father to take me back. Pride was the only thing I owned outright, and I guarded it fiercely. It was at one of those late-night cleaning jobs that I met her, Mrs. Adler. She was a retired law professor who worked part-time as a night clerk to stay busy. She had a sharp tongue but kind eyes. One night, after catching me dozing off near the elevator, she asked, "You studying somewhere or just surviving?" "Surviving," I said. That word must have hit her, because she looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You've got too much fire in your eyes to waste it on survival." She started talking to me during breaks, about life, law, how power often hides in knowledge. She'd bring me old textbooks, tell me about scholarships, and remind me that starting from nothing wasn't a curse. It was a chance to build without permission. Mrs. Adler became the first person who saw me without pity. She called me Miss Potential, and though it sounded corny, I clung to it. Because someone finally believed in me without conditions. She helped me apply to community college, even wrote my recommendation letter. When I got accepted, I cried harder than I ever had in my life. College wasn't glamorous. I balanced classes with shifts at a diner, often falling asleep over textbooks. But every test I passed, every project I finished, felt like reclaiming a piece of my stolen self-worth. Slowly, my mind became sharper, my heart stronger. I learned how the world worked, and more importantly, how to navigate it without depending on anyone's mercy. There were moments of humiliation, of course. Relatives would spot me working and whisper, "That's Robert's daughter." What a shame. I used to flinch at that, but eventually I learned to let their words slide off me like oil on water. Their scorn became my silent fuel. By my final year, I was top of my class. I started tutoring others for extra money, which led me to realize something powerful. I had a knack for solving problems, for organizing chaos. That seed eventually grew into my business idea years later. But back then, I was just proud to pay rent on a tiny studio that smelled like burnt toast and freedom. Sometimes I'd still drive past my old house. The lights were always on, laughter spilling from the windows. I'd sit there for a minute, then drive away before the ache got too loud. Because I knew something they didn't. That loneliness, as brutal as it was, had become my teacher. And though I didn't know it yet, that teacher was preparing me for a rise none of them would see coming. Success didn't come with fireworks. It came quietly, through long nights, caffeine, rejection emails, and the steady hum of borrowed laptops in co-working spaces that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. When people talk about overnight success, they never mention the 1,000 nights that came before it. Mine were lonely, heavy, and uncertain. But I kept showing up. It started with an idea, an app that connected small local artisans to buyers without the middlemen who drained their profits. I built it not because I saw a billion-dollar market, but because I knew what it felt like to have talent and no one willing to believe in it. At first, no investor cared. I was too young, too female, too unproven. I learned to live with the polite dismissals and fake smiles that said, "She'll burn out soon." But I didn't. The breakthrough came 2 years in, when a small online business magazine featured my story. From couch to CEO, the girl who built her way out. I remember staring at the headline, my coffee trembling in my hand. My name in print, not tied to my father's, not hidden behind anyone else's, just mine. That day, my app's downloads tripled. Investors called. People who once ignored my emails started remembering my name. It was intoxicating. Not the fame, but the validation. The world that once doubted me now wanted a piece of me. Yet even as I celebrated, something inside me stayed still. I smiled in interviews. I shook hands at conferences. I said all the right things about resilience and vision. But behind every applause, I heard echoes of my father's voice. "You'll come crawling back." Only I hadn't crawled. I'd built wings. The more my company grew, the more guarded I became. My office overlooked the same streets I once walked barefoot in the rain, carrying a duffel bag and nothing else. That contrast haunted me. Every decision, every deal. I made them with precision, as if any slip might send me right back to that bus stop on the edge of nowhere. My employees respected me, but they never really knew me. They saw the poised CEO who, dressed in black, spoke calmly and never raised her voice. They didn't know the version of me who cried into fast food napkins or stitched together self-belief from broken pieces. I learned early that vulnerability is a luxury success doesn't always allow. One morning, I received an invitation to an exclusive local business gala. They were giving me an award, Innovator of the Year. My first thought was how ironic it was. The same city that had once turned its back on me now wanted to celebrate me. The night of the gala, as cameras flashed and people clapped, I stood on stage and thanked everyone, the mentors, the team, the community. I didn't mention the man who made me fight for every ounce of worth I had. Still, when the applause faded, I felt a hollowness I couldn't quite name. I'd spent years chasing the version of success that would make me untouchable, unbreakable. But standing there under bright lights and polite smiles, I realized I was still running from that slammed door, that 17-year-old girl in the rain. I thought success would silence the past. Instead, it just gave it better acoustics. After the event, I went home, kicked off my heels, and sat by the window, watching my city pulse with life. Somewhere out there, my father still lived. Maybe reading headlines, maybe pretending not to. The thought didn't sting anymore. It just floated there like an old scar you stop tracing. I took a deep breath and whispered, "You didn't see this coming, did you?" Not out of spite, but truth. Because the rise wasn't just about money or headlines. It was about survival. About proving to myself that I was never who he said I was. And as the city lights shimmered below, I finally let myself smile. Not the practiced smile of a CEO, but the quiet one of a woman who'd already won long before the world noticed. The call came on a quiet Wednesday evening. My phone buzzed and I glanced at the screen. Ethan. My stomach tightened. It had been over a decade since I'd heard from him, not counting the rare, terse texts that never invited a reply. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity, and a strange, lingering part of sisterly hope, made me answer. "Hey," he said, voice casual, almost cheerful. "It's been a while." I cleared my throat. "Yes, a long while?" He laughed, a little too lightly. "I was thinking, maybe we could catch up? Dinner? Talk a bit?" Something about the invitation felt rehearsed, like a scene in a play where I was supposed to forgive and forget. But I agreed. I was cautious, guarded, polite. That night, he showed up at the restaurant I picked, eyes darting nervously before settling into a forced smile. He complimented my outfit, my hair, the obvious success that radiated from every confident step I took. I let him talk, letting him think he controlled the narrative. After the pleasantries, the conversation shifted. He hesitated, then said, "Dad, he's not doing well. Finances, health, he's worried about the company, about you, about everything." I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth. Something in his tone told me this wasn't concern. It was strategy. I could see it in his eyes, the old greed, the same manipulation I'd learned to read in my father years ago. "I see," I said, carefully neutral. "And you thought telling me this would—" "What exactly?" He shrugged, pretending innocence. "Just thought you should know. Maybe help him? He's your father, after all." I smiled politely, hiding the tightening in my chest. "I understand." But inside, I could feel the old ache stirring, that memory of being told I wasn't enough, of doors slammed, of promises broken. The difference now was I wasn't powerless. I could see the subtle ways they tried to pull me back into the world I'd fought so hard to leave. Throughout dinner, he spoke about their father's hard times, weaving stories of loneliness and regret, painting me as the prodigal daughter who could fix everything. I listened, nodding, asking questions without revealing my thoughts. I was polite, controlled, but my mind raced. Every word he said was a thread, and I was untangling the pattern. The old pain hidden behind rehearsed smiles, the bitterness thinly veiled as concern. By the end of the meal, I knew this wasn't reconciliation. It was reconnaissance. They wanted to see what I'd become, how vulnerable I might still be. And I understood, in that quiet moment as I walked him to the door, that the war I thought was over had only paused. I watched him leave, smiling politely as he waved goodbye, and whispered under my breath, "I see you." And I see him. The envelope came on a Tuesday morning, stark white and heavier than it had any right to be. My assistant handed it over with an almost nervous hesitation, the kind people get when they know the news will shake your world. I sliced it open, expecting bills, audits, or perhaps another investor inquiry. What I found instead made my stomach drop and my pulse spike in ways I hadn't felt since my teenage years. It was from my father's lawyer. He was suing me, not over a business dispute or a contract, but over my life, my success, my accomplishments, everything I'd built from nothing. He claimed that because he had raised me, he was entitled to half of my company's assets. The words blurred together as disbelief and rage collided inside me. He wanted my empire because of what? Because I had survived, thrived, and refused to obey him? For a moment, I simply sat there, the envelope trembling in my hands, staring out at the city I had carved for myself. It was surreal. My name, my success, suddenly dragged into a courtroom like a piece of property. Headlines appeared within hours online. Estranged father sues daughter for fortune she built. Self-made CEO faces family feud in court. My employees whispered in the hallway, their eyes wide with shock and sympathy. Some even offered quiet words of support that made me ache, but I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I had spent years learning to compartmentalize, to turn pain into strategy. My father had assumed that because he could break me once, he still had the power. What he didn't understand was that the girl who had once slept in her car, who had survived humiliation and hunger, now ran a company that didn't just exist, it thrived. I picked up the envelope again and read it carefully. Every clause, every demand, every insinuation of entitlement was ammunition for me. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. He thought he was cornering me, but I saw the entire board, every angle, every weak spot in his plan. I would respond, not with screams or tears, but with precision. By mid-morning, the office was buzzing. My team sensed the tension even before I addressed it. I called everyone into the conference room, kept my tone calm but firm. "We've got a challenge," I said, "but we're going to handle it the way we handle everything here. Methodically, strategically, and with dignity." They nodded, some unsure, some inspired, and I could feel the reversal happening. The victim of my father's cruelty was no longer panicked. The woman he had once disowned was now the composed strategist. Later, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the lawsuit documents again. I could almost hear him, pacing in his study, imagining that this would destabilize me, but the reality was different. I had spent my life building resilience, intelligence, and patience. Weapons he had underestimated. My anger burned hot, but it was measured, contained. It fueled clarity, not chaos. I remembered the nights I had cried quietly in a car, the hunger, the humiliation, the endless months of proving myself to a world that had forgotten me. Now, I had power, and I would wield it with the precision that years of struggle had taught me. By the time the sun began to dip behind the skyline, I had already begun drafting my response with my lawyers. Every line, every sentence was calculated. I would not only defend myself, but I would expose every lie, every manipulation, every ounce of entitlement he tried to claim. For the first time in years, I felt a certain satisfaction. Not revenge yet, that would come later, but justice, in its quiet, inevitable way, was beginning to shape itself. The girl who once had nothing had learned how to survive, how to strategize, and now, how to dominate the battlefield her father had unwittingly created. The courthouse smelled of polished wood, paper, and a faint trace of anxiety that seemed to cling to everyone inside. I sat in the defendant's chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, heart steady but eyes sharp. Across from me, my father sat smug, perfectly coiffed, the picture of self-righteousness. His lawyer began immediately, painting a story I knew by heart. The ungrateful child, who had turned her back on the family, now denying the father who had supposedly given her everything. I remained silent, letting the words wash over the room. Every accusation was a sharpened dagger aimed to wound, and the whispers from the gallery felt like invisible chains tightening around me. I could see the judge scribbling notes, the court reporter typing rapidly, the air thick with tension. My father leaned forward, eyes glinting with expectation, waiting for a reaction that would satisfy his need for control. Anger threatened to rise, but I suppressed it. My lawyer, a quiet woman with a calming presence, leaned close and whispered, "Let them speak first. The truth has more power in silence." Her voice was soft, but it anchored me. She knew something I hadn't let myself admit. In moments like this, restraint is more lethal than shouting. The lawyer continued, twisting my father's narrative into venomous accusations. She ignored her family, abandoned her obligations, and now refuses to acknowledge the debt she owes to her father, he said, each word designed to make me shrink. The gallery murmured. The tension was palpable. My father's smirk widened. He was certain of victory, certain that I would crack. But I didn't. Instead, I let them dig deeper, watching as his own arrogance became a trap. Every exaggeration, every moral judgment, every feigned display of paternal concern only built a tighter cage around his pride. I felt a surge of power in my calm, a quiet thrill in knowing that his scheme depended on me responding with outrage. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I glanced at my lawyer, who gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, a signal that the real moment was coming. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but the narrative was already shifting. By remaining silent, I allowed them to overplay their hand. Every word my father's lawyer spoke, every smug glance, every pointed accusation only revealed the man behind the suit. Controlling, insecure, desperate to assert dominance through shame. For the first time in months, I felt a strange serenity. I was no longer the scared girl from the rainy streets, no longer trembling in a parking lot, no longer desperate for approval. I was calm, strategic, and fully aware of the reversal unfolding. The audience, every person in that room, felt it too, even if they couldn't articulate it yet. As the first half of the hearing drew to a close, my father's pride had already begun to unravel under the weight of his own arrogance. He didn't realize it, but his victory had slipped through his fingers. And I, silent and composed, knew that when the time came to speak, the truth would land harder than any words he could throw at me. When the clerk called my name, my chest tightened for a fraction of a second, then steadied. I stood, straightened my blazer, and walked to the stand like I owned every step. The courtroom fell quiet, the murmurs dwindling into silence as all eyes followed me. My father's smirk was still there, arrogant and unreadable, as if he thought I would falter, as if he expected tears or stammering apologies. But I had none to offer. I swore the oath and then I began. My voice was calm, controlled, almost conversational, but each word carried the weight of years he had tried to erase. I spoke of the nights I went hungry while he and Ethan dined on silver platters. I spoke of the cold nights sleeping in cars, the whispered insults, the doors slammed in my face, the rejection I carried like a heavy coat every day of my teenage years. I painted a picture not to provoke sympathy, but to lay bare the truth. The courtroom absorbed it in stunned silence. You could feel the tension crackling in the air, my words hitting where their rehearsed defenses couldn't shield them. My father's smirk twitched for a second, just a flicker, but I pressed on, steady, unwavering. I spoke of the countless times I had clawed my way back from despair. Every odd job, every scholarship, every hour spent proving to myself that I mattered, even when the person who was supposed to love me had abandoned me. Then I paused. I let the memory settle in. The gallery was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, pen hovering over paper. My father's lawyer began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the momentum turning. And then I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a set of legal documents. "These," I said, lifting the papers with deliberate clarity, "are my mother's original will and its subsequent amendments." I let my eyes meet my father's. "And these," I continued, "show the modifications you made without her knowledge, to claim what was never yours." Gasps ran quietly through the courtroom. My father froze, mouth opening slightly as the color drained from his face. The judge's hand paused mid-note, eyes wide, voice caught somewhere between professional control and astonishment. The weight of years of deceit now lay bare before everyone. I held the papers carefully, almost reverently. "You tried to take what was rightfully mine," I said, voice steady, controlled. "You tried to rewrite history, to erase the truth. But truth, as you see, cannot be hidden forever." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. My father's jaw clenched, his ego unable to compute that the child he had discarded had grown into someone who could dismantle his lies with calm precision. The whisper stopped entirely, replaced by a heavy, almost electric silence. I returned the documents to my briefcase, closed it slowly, and let the truth hang in the air. I could see the cracks in his facade, the tightness around his eyes, the shallow breath, the realization that control had slipped from his hands. He wanted to argue, to deflect, to twist the narrative back in his favor, but I had already won something far more powerful. Undeniable truth. As I stepped down from the stand, my lawyer gave me a subtle nod, the kind that said, "The tide has turned." And in that instant, I understood that the courtroom was no longer a place of intimidation. It was a stage for justice, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer the scared girl waiting to be dismissed. I was the one holding the truth, calm and unshakable, and no one, not even him, could take that from me. It took me years to uncover what my father had hidden. I knew there had always been more. Whispers in legal documents, mentions in old letters, hints in my mother's handwriting. But it wasn't until I was deep into business, with patience honed by survival, that I could trace the truth. My mother, the only person who had ever believed in me without condition, had left me an educational trust fund. It wasn't just a gesture of love. It was a blueprint for a life she wanted me to claim, free from his control. I remember the day I found the original papers. They were tucked in a safety deposit box under her name, buried beneath decades of her personal correspondence. My father had forged the amendments, rerouting the trust to himself, claiming expenses, fees, and advice that were fabricated entirely. The realization hit like a punch. He had stolen my inheritance not out of need, but out of control, ego, and greed. 15 years of my rightful fortune vanished under his manipulation, and no one had said a word. I didn't confront him immediately. I studied the documents, memorized the timeline, traced every misappropriated fund. I worked quietly, reconstructing my financial foundation with painstaking precision. Every investment, every small business idea, every late-night plan to grow my startup, they were funded in part by reclaiming what had always been mine. I did not want revenge. I wanted restoration, and I did it without him ever knowing. In court, I presented the evidence calmly, step by step. The original trust documents, my calculations of what had been diverted, and the legal precedents that proved his forgery. My father's smugness cracked as the truth unfolded. He tried to interject, to claim misunderstanding, to twist the narrative. But each attempt only revealed more of his deception. His empire of lies was collapsing in real time. I could feel the room react. The judge leaned forward, disbelief etched into every line of her face. My father's lawyer flailed, searching for loopholes that didn't exist. And my father, he sat frozen, mouth slightly open, hands clenched as the weight of 15 years of lies bore down on him. For once, he was silent. What struck me most wasn't just the legal vindication, though that was sweet. It was the emotional reversal. The girl who had once been dismissed, ignored, and exiled had quietly reclaimed what was hers. He had built a house on theft and manipulation, and it was crumbling beneath his own arrogance. The trust fund was more than money. It was proof that I had been right all along, that my mother had believed in me when he never had. I watched him shift in his seat, the mask of entitlement melting. My lawyers whispered quietly, reminding me to stay calm, to let the facts speak. And they did. Every figure, every paper, every irrefutable signature echoed louder than any accusation he could make. The courtroom was still, caught between disbelief and awe. I thought about my mother then, the woman who had taught me resilience, integrity, and patience. She had left me a seed, knowing that one day I would claim it. And now, standing there, I realized I had not only reclaimed it, I had multiplied it, turned it into a foundation that no one could take away. Not even him. By the time the judge called for a recess, The emotional weight had settled like thunder. I sat back, breathing slowly, feeling a satisfaction that was quiet but absolute. He had thought he could manipulate, control, and erase me. Instead, I had silently become the woman he underestimated, armed with the very inheritance he tried to steal. 15 years of secrets, lies, and theft unraveled, and I had emerged intact, whole, and more powerful than ever. The courtroom held its breath. Every whisper, every shuffling of papers, every quiet cough seemed amplified against the weight of what had just been revealed. The judge's pen hovered midair, eyes scanning the documents again as if confirming what her own mind refused to accept. I could feel the tension radiating from the gallery, the air thick with anticipation, disbelief, and something closer to awe. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice measured but carrying the authority of undeniable truth. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her gaze locking on my father, "you've committed fraud against your own child." The words hit like a hammer. I watched as the color drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid mask of shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried to formulate a response, a defense, a way to twist reality back in his favor. But the silence from the bench was deafening. Every attempt at bravado fell flat against the weight of the evidence I had laid bare. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a chorus of realization and judgment. People leaned forward, craning their necks, whispering about the audacity, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of a man trying to steal from his own child. My employees, my friends, the legal team, all watched with bated breath, their eyes on me, waiting to see what I would do next. I inhaled slowly, savoring the moment of quiet victory. Calmly, deliberately, I looked at him. Really looked, as if seeing him for the first time in years. The smugness that had once defined him had crumbled, leaving a hollow shadow of the man who had disowned me, humiliated me, and tried to erase my life. "You wanted my fortune." "Dad," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle, carrying every ounce of power I had accumulated over the years. "But it was never yours to begin with." The words landed like thunder, echoing in every corner of the room. I could see the reaction on his face, disbelief, humiliation, rage, helplessness, all in one fleeting expression. The courtroom seemed suspended in that moment, as if holding its breath to witness the final act of poetic justice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout or gloat. I let the simple truth, spoken plainly and firmly, do all the work. His lies, his manipulation, his attempts to control my life had unraveled in the silence of honesty and evidence. The irony was almost exquisite. All the power he had tried to claim over me dissolved in a single, unshakable statement. The judge nodded slightly, her expression firm but acknowledging the weight of the moment. My father remained pale, speechless, grasping at the remnants of dignity that had already slipped through his fingers. The crowd's murmurs shifted into a subdued hush, the kind of silence that comes after witnessing a reckoning long overdue. I took a breath, letting the tension ease from my shoulders, though not from the room. I had arrived at this moment not through vengeance, but through patience, persistence, and truth. Every struggle, every humiliation, every lonely night had led me here. The girl who had once been powerless was now untouchable, not through aggression, but through undeniable clarity and justice. For the first time, I allowed a quiet smile to touch my lips, the kind that comes from knowing you've endured, outlasted, and ultimately outsmarted the very person who once thought he could destroy you. The courtroom remained silent, not in fear, but in awe. The balance had shifted. The power had changed hands, and for the first time in years, I felt completely, irrevocably victorious. The courtroom was tense, every person leaning forward, waiting for the words that would seal years of injustice. My father sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight, eyes darting nervously between the judge and me, as if trying to summon some hidden advantage. The air was thick, electric with anticipation. I kept my posture calm, composed, letting the weight of the moment settle on everyone else while I remained steady. Finally, the judge spoke, her gavel tapping once against the sound block. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony, this court finds in favor of the defendant," All claims by Mr. Harrington regarding entitlement to Ms. Harrington's assets are dismissed. Furthermore, restitution for the misappropriated inheritance shall be made immediately." The words hung in the air, solid and final. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and whispers rippled through the courtroom like a wave. I could feel the collective exhale of relief and astonishment around me. My father's face had turned pale, then red, then a dull gray of humiliation. The man who once wielded control like a weapon now looked small, exposed, stripped of authority in front of everyone he had hoped to impress. I didn't celebrate. I didn't shout, didn't gesture triumphantly. Instead, I rose from my seat and walked past him with measured steps. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, a calm, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo in the hushed room. He turned his gaze to me, as if expecting a sneer, a mocking smile, a cruel remark. But I offered none of it. When I reached his side, I leaned slightly, speaking quietly, yet firmly enough for him to hear. "I forgive you, but I'll never owe you again." The words carried more power than any gloat or retort could. Forgiveness, tempered with unbreakable boundaries, left him speechless. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, the realization that he would no longer have influence over me, no matter his attempts or his schemes. The magnitude of his failure, both moral and social, was laid bare, and he could do nothing to reclaim it. Around us, the courtroom continued to stir. Reporters captured every expression. Witnesses whispered to each other, and my legal team exhaled quietly, satisfied with the justice achieved. But I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet internal victory that was far more satisfying than any public display. Years of struggle, humiliation, and manipulation had culminated in this moment. I had reclaimed what was mine, and asserted the boundaries I had always deserved. I turned to leave, my steps purposeful, my head held high. No one could question my right to walk freely in the space I had earned. The flashes of cameras followed me, but they no longer mattered. My past, my father's attempts at control, the humiliation I had endured, all of it had been acknowledged, confronted, and corrected in the most absolute way. As I stepped out into the sunlight after the trial, the city seemed to shimmer differently. Every challenge I had faced, every lonely night, every ounce of resilience, had built the woman who now walked unshakable, unafraid, and free. I didn't look back. There was no need. Justice had been served, and for the first time in years, the weight of my father's shadow no longer followed me. I visited my mother's grave on a quiet morning, the sunlight soft and forgiving as it spilled across the cemetery. The world seemed slower here, distant from flashing cameras, courtroom murmurs, and the echoes of my father's greed. I sat on the cool grass, hands resting lightly on the stone, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to simply breathe. The weight of anger, resentment, and expectation lifted slowly, replaced by something gentler, quiet understanding and peace. I spoke softly, not because anyone needed to hear me, but because my words were for her. "We did it," I whispered. "I finally reclaimed what was yours, what was mine." I didn't need to fight loudly. I didn't need to humiliate him. I just needed to be patient and strong. The memories of humiliation, abandonment, and struggle swirled around me, but they no longer cut sharply. They had shaped me, yes, but they no longer defined me. I thought about the courtroom, the headlines, the victory, and I realized something essential. Justice doesn't always need applause, cameras, or recognition. Sometimes justice is measured in the quiet dignity of standing firm, of reclaiming what is right without losing yourself in rage or spectacle. The satisfaction wasn't in seeing my father humbled. It was in knowing that I had endured, survived, and maintained my integrity. The breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers and distant city life. I imagined open roads stretching ahead, possibilities unbound by the past. My business thrived, yes, and my life was secure. But that security felt secondary to the calm pride that settled in my chest. Wealth, headlines, and power were fleeting. This sense of self, forged in solitude and struggle, was permanent. I whispered one last time, Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's quiet, like dignity. And in that quiet, I felt my mother's presence, not as a shadow, but as a gentle guide who had always believed in me. The girl who slept in cars, who faced ridicule and abandonment, had grown into a woman who carried herself with unshakable strength. I rose from the grave, brushed the grass from my coat, and walked away without looking back. There was no gloating, no triumphal display, only peace, only the quiet knowledge that I had survived, reclaimed what was mine, and honored the woman who had given me the courage to do so. And as I stepped into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face, I understood that true victory was not in defeating him, but in claiming myself. Weeks after the trial, a package arrived at my office. My assistant handed it to me with the same careful hesitation as the summons months before, but this time, I didn't hesitate. The envelope was plain, unassuming, bearing only my name and my father's unmistakable scrawl. I recognized it immediately. The handwriting I had once dreaded, now just a relic of a past that no longer held power over me. I tore it open slowly, aware that whatever lay inside would be heavy with regret, shame, or perhaps one final attempt at manipulation. Instead, I found something different, words of admission. He wrote about his failures, the pride that had blinded him, the years he had wasted trying to control me instead of supporting me. There was no apology I needed to accept, no reconciliation I was required to offer. It was simply truth laid bare on paper, raw and unadorned. I read it silently, letting the sentences flow through me without reaction. No tears, no shivers, no anger, just a quiet acknowledgement that the man who had taught me fear and greed had finally been confronted with the consequences of his own actions. And I had done nothing but stand firm. The envelope remained in my hands as I reflected on the journey, the girl who had been abandoned, the years of struggle, the nights of loneliness, the court battles, and the ultimate reclaiming of what was rightfully mine. All of it had led to this moment of quiet closure. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and set it on my desk. The sunlight fell across it, warm and forgiving, as if marking the end of a long, arduous chapter. I whispered to myself, almost as if sharing the thought with the world. He taught me greed. I taught him silence. The weight of the words was satisfying, not because they carried vengeance, but because they carried finality. There was no triumphal shouting, no need to gloat. The story had reached its natural, satisfying conclusion. Justice achieved, dignity intact, and peace reclaimed. And as I leaned back in my chair, feeling the sunlight on my face, I realized something essential. We can't choose our parents, but we can choose who we become after they break us. Every choice, every struggle, every act of patience and persistence had sculpted me into someone stronger, calmer, unshakable. The past had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. With one final glance at the envelope, I closed it gently, a symbolic gesture of letting go. Outside, the world moved on as it always does, indifferent to old wounds and old debts. But inside, I carried a quiet victory that no one could take away. The satisfaction of having endured, reclaimed, and emerged whole. Sometimes I sit quietly and think about all the years that led me here. The nights of hunger, the whispered insults, the doors slammed in my face, and the echoes of my father's disapproval. Those moments could have broken me. They could have made me bitter, vengeful, or small. But they didn't. I learned something vital along the way. We can't choose our parents, but we can choose who we become after they break us. Silence became my greatest teacher. In it, I found patience, clarity, and the power to act without rage. It allowed me to observe, to plan, and to reclaim what was mine. Not through loud confrontation, but through measured truth and unwavering integrity. The quiet moments revealed strength I didn't know I had, shaping me into someone resilient, composed, and unshakable. To anyone watching, understand this. Life will hand you betrayals, abandonment, and injustices. It will test your spirit and your resolve, but there is a choice in every response. You can let bitterness consume you, or you can transform it into strategy, self-respect, and dignity. True power doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from mastering your emotions, standing firm, and reclaiming your life on your own terms. Looking back, I see the girl I once was, trembling and afraid, and I feel pride for the woman I've become. The past doesn't define me, the hurt doesn't dictate my future, and the silence, once a symbol of my oppression, now speaks louder than any argument, any confrontation, or any courtroom victory ever could. Peace isn't flashy. It doesn't demand recognition, but it is absolute. And for me, that quiet triumph is the sweetest sound of all.